In 1907, a woman stands in the endless Ellis Island line, exhausted after weeks at sea. She speaks no English, owns almost nothing, and clutches the only thing she refused to leave behind. Hidden inside the hem of her skirt and stitched into her apron is food from her old village in Sicily, recipes, flavors, traditions America could never understand. The inspectors search for disease. They search papers and faces. But they never search for what truly mattered. Because the moment she stepped into America, carrying the old country with her, she became a threat to a system that wanted immigrants to forget their food, their culture, and start buying instead. She never forgot. These are the 25 foods she carried. Number 25, Terali, a ring the size of a woman's fist. Baked once, boiled briefly, baked again until it rang like ceramic when you tapped it on the ship's railing. Women from Puglia and Campania made them by the dozens before leaving. They cost almost nothing. A kilo of flour ran 2 cents in southern Italy in 1903. They survived everything: salt water, engine heat, 3 weeks in a cloth sack pressed against a human body. You broke them apart and ate them dry, or you soaked them in water and they softened just enough. Plain, sometimes fennel seed, sometimes black pepper, nothing else needed. Today we call them Italian snack crackers and sell them at Whole Foods for $8 a bag with a photograph of Tuscany on the label. Grandma just called them something to eat on the boat. Number 24, dried figs. Sicilian women sewed them directly into hem pockets. Individual figs, dried on flat rocks in August sun until they were wrinkled and collapsed and concentrated into something closer to sugar than fruit. 100 grams of dried fig carries 280 calories and more potassium than a banana. They cost nothing. Every family in Calabria and Sicily had a fig tree in the yard. You dried what you couldn't eat. You carried what you dried. The inspectors never looked twice at a dried fig. It looked harmless. It was the most efficient food a human being could carry across an ocean. She knew that. She didn't need a nutritionist to tell her. Number 23, lupini beans. Fermented in brine for 2 weeks before the journey, firm, slightly sour, eaten cold from a cloth pouch. Working-class Naples sold them from street carts for a penny, a handful in the 1900s. They contain 36 grams of protein per 100 grams, more protein per ounce than chicken breast. This is not something people discovered recently. Sicilian and Neapolitan women knew it in 1905. They packed lupini because lupini kept. The brine preserved them. You could reach into a wet cloth sack 3 weeks into an ocean crossing and pull out a perfect bean. Now, keto influencers on YouTube have discovered lupini beans and are calling them a superfood. They are charging $12 for a small jar. Grandma just called them lupini. She ate them on the boat. Number 22, colatura di alici. A vial, sometimes ceramic, sometimes glass, sometimes just a small bottle stopped with wax. Inside, fermented anchovy oil. The liquid that drips from anchovies, packed in salt and pressed under weight for months in the fishing village of Sitara on the Amalfi Coast. A few drops changed everything. A few drops turned plain boiled pasta into a meal that tasted like the sea and the village and home. Women carried vials of it pressed against their bodies because it was irreplaceable. You could not buy it in America. You could not make it in an apartment in Brooklyn without the anchovies and the wooden barrels and the Campanian sun. The Romans made a version of this. They called it garum. It never died, it just traveled. Today, specialty shops sell small bottles of colatura for $40. In 1907, it was something a woman's grandmother made in a ceramic pot and passed down like jewelry. Number 21, dried chestnuts. The mountain villages of Calabria and Abruzzo ran on chestnuts, not as a garnish, as grain. In the Apennine Highlands in the 1890s, chestnut flour was cheaper than wheat flour and more available. Whole chestnuts were dried on wooden racks over low fires for weeks. until they were hard as stones and would keep for a year. Women carried them in small cloth bags. You could boil them soft in 20 minutes. You could grind them and make a porridge. You could eat them as they were, hard and slightly smoky, the taste of the hillside that raised you. They cost nothing. They fell from the trees. The forest fed entire families through winter, and when those families got on a boat to America, they brought the forest with them. Number 20. Mostarda. Fruit quince, pear, fig suspended in a syrup of sugar and mustard oil. It sounds strange. It kept for months without refrigeration. The mustard compounds, allyl isothiocyanate, if you want the chemistry, are naturally antimicrobial. They inhibit mold and bacterial growth at the molecular level. This was not luck. Families in Cremona had been making mostarda for 500 years. They knew it kept. They didn't know why it kept. They didn't need to. The knowing was in the hands, passed from grandmother to daughter across generations, while scientists in laboratories were still figuring out what bacteria actually were. She was right. Everything she knew was right. Number 19. Lardo. Pure pork fatback, cured for months in marble troughs with rosemary, garlic, black pepper, and sea salt. From Colonnata, a village in the Tuscan mountains so small it barely appears on maps. Thin sliced, almost translucent, white as snow with the faintest pink edge. A small block of lardo was the most calorie-dense food a woman could legally conceal. Fat carries 9 calories per gram. Nothing else comes close. On a crossing where the ship's food was sometimes inedible and sometimes simply not enough, lardo was survival arithmetic done correctly. Inspectors feared fat. American food culture was already beginning to turn against it. That fear would be manufactured into a 50-year public health campaign that enriched vegetable oil companies and destroyed the metabolic health of an entire nation. She didn't fear fat. She was right. Today, Lardo di Colonnata has protected geographic status and sells for $30 a pound at charcuterie counters in American cities. The same cities where Italian immigrants used to eat it quietly in their apartments so the neighbors wouldn't stare. Number 18. Frizzelle. A ring of bread, baked twice until it was hard enough to use as a doorstop. From Puglia. 1 cent per piece in 1905. Ancient sailor food. Crusader era. Some historians argue. Carried by soldiers who needed bread that wouldn't rot on a ship. You soaked a frizzella in seawater, or fresh water if you had it, for 30 seconds. It softened to the texture of thick bread. You pressed olive oil into it if you had oil. You crumbled dried tomato on it if you had tomato. You ate it plain if you had nothing else. Today, restaurants in Lower Manhattan call it bruschetta base and charge $14 for 2 pieces with a smear of ricotta and a drizzle of honey. Grandma just called it bread. Number 17. Ricotta salata. Not the soft, white, fresh ricotta Americans know from lasagna. Nothing like it. Pressed, salted, and dried for weeks, until it was dense and firm and pale, ivory, the texture somewhere between feta and dry, Parmesan. Sicilian, ancient. It didn't need refrigeration. A small wheel could last the entire crossing wrapped in cloth. Sliced thin, it was a complete food. Crumbled over bread soaked in water, it was a meal. The salt content was its own preservative. The protein was real and dense. Modern restaurants place thin shavings of it over arugula salads for $18. The same cheese women carried in their aprons through the inspection lines at Ellis Island, tucked between their arms and their ribs, declared to no one. Number 16. Peperoncini sotto sale. Hot peppers packed in salt until they collapsed and softened and became something concentrated and fierce, more flavor per pinch than anything fresh. Calabrian women made them from their garden every August. The salt drew the moisture out. The capsaicin and the salt together created an environment where almost nothing harmful could grow. This is lactofermentation. The food industry spent the second half of the 20th century figuring out how to manufacture and patent variations of a process that Calabrian grandmothers had been doing in ceramic crocks since before the American Civil War. Here's what the food industry doesn't want you to know: they didn't invent fermentation. They invented the idea that you needed them to do it for you. Number 15. Ammolio. Sun-dried tomatoes, garlic, wild oregano, salt worked together until they formed a rough paste, then dried further into a dense ball the size of a walnut. Sicilian. Made on rooftops in July, when tomatoes cost nothing and the sun was violent enough to do the work in 2 days. A walnut-sized piece of ammoglio dissolved in a cup of hot water became sauce. Added to boiling pasta water, it transformed the water. Rubbed on bread, it was a complete flavor experience. Acid and heat and herb, and the deep sweetness of concentrated tomato. This was the same decade Heinz was patenting its industrial tomato ketchup and convincing America that tomato products came in glass bottles from factories. The women with ammoglio in their aprons were not impressed. Number 14. Estrato di pomodoro. Not tomato paste from a can. Not even close. Sicilian tomato extract started as crushed tomatoes spread in a thick layer on large wooden boards and left in the August sun for 3 days, stirred every few hours, reduced until the color deepened from red to almost burgundy, and the texture became so dense it held a spoon upright. The flavor is not louder than canned paste. It is different in kind, deeper, slower, something umami adjacent that no industrial process has replicated, because industrial processes take hours, not days, and they do not use the sun. Women carried small crocks of it sealed with a film of olive oil. A tablespoon was a week's worth of sauce. Number 13. Aged pecorino. Sheep's milk cheese, aged until it was hard and crystalline at the edges and sharp enough to make your eyes water. From Sardinia, from Sicily, from wherever sheep climbed hills too rocky for cattle. A small wedge lasted months. The salt and the low moisture content made it nearly impervious to spoilage. Calcium content per ounce rivals any supplement manufactured in the 21st century. Women tucked wedges of it into cloth bags between their clothing. Inspectors in 1905 feared raw milk cheese. The American milk supply in 1905 was so poorly handled that tuberculosis outbreaks were regularly traced to it. The cheese in her apron was safer than the milk inspectors drank at home. That is not a coincidence. That is the difference between food that has been made carefully for 1,000 years and food that has been made quickly for profit. Number 12. Bronte pistachios. From the slopes of Mount Etna in eastern Sicily. Harvested only every other year, the trees need rest. Vivid green, almost electric, with a buttery richness that bears almost no resemblance to the salted, roasted American pistachio. No shell dye, no added salt. Just the nut, dried, carried in a small cloth. Women from the Catania province carried handfuls of them as much for comfort as for calories. A pistachio from Bronte tasted specifically of home, of a particular volcanic soil, a particular altitude, a particular October harvest. You cannot buy that flavor in America. You can buy something called Bronte pistachio products in specialty shops for $25 a jar. It is not the same thing. The women on the boat knew the difference. Number 11. Wild fennel seed, free. From every hillside in Sicily and Calabria, tied in small cloth bundles and carried in apron pockets. The seeds are sweet and anise-sharp and medicinally serious, used for centuries to calm infant digestion, relieve gas, settle seasickness, ease the cramping that came from eating poorly on a 3-week crossing. A mother with wild fennel seeds in her pocket had a pharmacy. She could make a tea for a sick child in 2 minutes. She could flavor a plain food into something bearable. She could press a bundle under her nose when the lower decks of the ship smelled like what lower decks of immigrant ships smelled like. They knew things about plants that we will spend the next 50 years trying to remember. Number Deech. Sopressata. Hard-dried salami from Calabria and Basilicata pork, seasoned with black pepper, dried chili, sometimes wild fennel, stuffed into natural casing and hung to cure for months until it was firm and dark and intensely flavored. 8 cents a pound in southern Italy in 1908. Women wrapped it in cloth that had been soaked in red wine vinegar and wrung mostly dry. The acetic acid in the vinegar created an antimicrobial surface layer that extended the salami's safe life by weeks. This was not folk magic. Acetic acid denatures bacterial proteins on contact. That is biochemistry. She didn't have the vocabulary. She had the knowledge. Those are not the same thing, and one of them is more important. Number Sembilan. Nduja. The poorest cuts of the Calabrian pig. The offal, the scraps, the parts that couldn't be sold mixed with Calabrian chili peppers, so fierce they turned everything they touched. Orange red, fermented, packed into casing, and spread like butter. Violent with heat, rich with fat, preserved by capsaicin and salt and thyme. It was what you made when you had nothing worth keeping but refused to waste it. The spice level served a practical purpose, antimicrobial, the capsaicin, but it also created something that had no equivalent anywhere in American food in 1907. Nothing here tasted like that. Nothing here came from that specific combination of poverty and ingenuity and red pepper heat. America spent 100 years ignoring nduja. Now it is on every artisan pizza menu in every major American city as a premium topping at $4 extra. The restaurant does not mention Calabria. The restaurant does not mention what it used to cost or who used to make it or why. Number 8. Caciocavallo. The name means cheese on horseback. It is tied in pairs and hung 2 teardrops of aged pasta filata cheese, roped together, draped over a beam to cure. From Campania, from Sicily, one of the oldest cheese forms in the Mediterranean world. The shape is not decorative. It evolved specifically for transport, tied to a saddle, hung from a rafter, carried under a coat. Women on the boat carried small forms of it tied against their bodies under their outer layers. The aged rind protected the interior. It needed nothing. A cheese designed over centuries for exactly the conditions of that journey. She didn't invent the solution, she inherited it. That is a different kind of intelligence and a more reliable one. Number 7. Raisins in lard. Sun-dried grapes from the family vineyard cost nothing preserved in a thin coating of lard to keep the moisture locked in. Sweet and dense and slightly waxy on the outside, chewy through the center. A small handful was 200 calories and a significant amount of iron. Women gave them to children. On a ship where the children's food was whatever the adults didn't finish and whatever didn't make them sick, raisins in lard were the sweetness in 3 weeks of misery. Children on those boats remembered the taste their whole lives. Some of them are still alive. Some of them had grandchildren who threw the recipe away. Number 6. Zibibo. From Pantelleria, a small volcanic island between Sicily and Tunisia, closer to Africa than to Rome. Moscato grapes, dried on woven mats in the island's relentless sun until they collapsed into something closer to candy than raisin, dark, intensely sweet, more sugar per gram than most manufactured candy. Women from Pantelleria carried them specifically, and the women who received them on the boat, women from Palermo, from Catania, from Agrigento, knew immediately where they came from. The flavor was that specific, that particular. The ship fed no children adequately. Their grandmothers did. With 6 dried grapes and a piece of hard bread, a child was fed. That is not a small thing. That is everything. Number 5. Altamura bread crust from Puglia. Made from durum semolina, a harder wheat, higher protein, denser crumb. Baked in wood-fired ovens that reach temperatures modern ovens cannot replicate. The crust, already thick, dried further until it was essentially a cracker. Carried in cloth sacks, it lasted for months. Soaked in water for 5 minutes, it became a porridge that filled you. Toasted in the fire, it became coating for meat. Ground fine, it was breadcrumbs. It was never thrown away. There was no state of Altamura bread crust that was not useful. Today, Pane di Altamura carries DOP-protected status and sells for $12 a loaf in American specialty groceries. The bread that poor Puglian families ate when they had almost nothing is now a luxury item. That is not progress. That is the food industry finding a new way to charge you for what your grandmother made for free. Number 4. Wild oregano. Not the pale, dusty, flavorless powder in the American spice aisle. Sicilian wild oregano tied in dense bundles, the stems still attached, flowers dried to a deep purple gray. The essential oil content in wild Sicilian oregano is 3 to 5 times higher than in cultivated oregano. It smells different, it tastes different, it functions differently. Carvacrol and thymol, the primary compounds in oregano essential oil, have documented antifungal and antibacterial properties. Women rubbed bundles of it on meat to extend its life. They brewed it as tea for sick children. They pressed it under their noses against the smell of the lower decks. It was a spice rack and a first aid kit and a piece of home, carried in a coat pocket across the Atlantic. Number 3. Vin Cotto. Cooked wine. Grape must the pressed skins and juice left after winemaking reduced in a copper pot over low heat for hours until it became a dark, thick syrup with the sweetness of molasses and the depth of something ancient. From Puglia. From Abruzzo. Every region had a version and a name. Used as a sweetener when sugar was expensive. Used as a digestive. Given to children with fevers, not because anyone knew about antioxidant polyphenols, though the grape skins are full of them, but because grandmothers knew it helped, and that was enough. Aged balsamic vinegar from Modena, the real kind, the kind that sells for $200 a bottle, is the direct descendant of Vin Cotto. The women who carried small ceramic vials of it across the Atlantic in 1907 could not have imagined that the syrup they made from pressed grape scraps would one day be sold in American stores as a luxury product. She was right. Everything she knew was right. Number 2. Cracked cured olives. Green olives, cracked with a stone so the brine penetrated to the pit, cured with wild fennel fronds, dried orange peel, red pepper, and sea salt. Sicilian, Calabrian. Made from trees that had been in the family longer than anyone could remember. They were carried in damp cloth. The brine kept them. They kept for the whole crossing without any refrigeration more sophisticated than a cloth bag and a cool corner of a wooden trunk. Women said they couldn't eat them on the boat without crying. Not because they were sad, exactly, because the flavor was so precisely the village they had left, that particular combination of that particular olive from that particular tree with wild fennel from that particular hillside, that eating one was not a snack. It was a departure all over again. They ate them anyway. They cried anyway. They kept walking. Number 1. Garlic lard. Pork fat rendered slow from the scraps of the family pig with garlic cloves cooked down until they were soft and golden and dissolved into the fat. Salt, sometimes rosemary, nothing else. Every family from Palermo to Bari made it. Every region had a name for it. Sugna, Zogna, Strutto al Aglio, it didn't matter what you called it. You spread it on bread. You needed nothing else. It cost nothing. It kept indefinitely in cool temperatures. A small crock of garlic lard was a week of meals for a woman traveling alone. It was the first food many of them ate when they cleared inspection and found a quiet corner and finally sat down. After 3 weeks on the ocean, after the fear of the medical line, After the terror of not knowing if they would be turned back, they sat down and they opened the cloth, and they spread garlic lard on the hard bread they had carried from the village. And for one moment they were home. Closing. She made it through. She spread garlic lard on bread in a corner of the great hall while America moved around her. She cracked an olive against her palm. She pressed her vial of colatura against her chest like a saint's medal. She unpacked the amoglio and the dried chestnuts and the cracked pecorino and the sopressata wrapped in vinegar cloth, and she began. These women were not carrying poor food. They were carrying centuries. They were carrying preservation science and nutritional intelligence and agricultural wisdom that took the rest of the world 100 years to validate in a laboratory. Here's what the food industry doesn't want you to know. They needed her to forget. They needed her daughters to be embarrassed. They needed her grandchildren to throw away the ceramic crocks and buy the canned version and pay the premium and call it Italian. They succeeded. For about 50 years, they succeeded completely. But the lupini bean is still the lupini bean. The colatura is still the colatura. The garlic lard is still the right answer at the end of a terrible journey. She was right. Everything she knew was right, and the food industry that called her food dangerous while selling her grandchildren white bread and shelf-stable cheese has never once apologized for what it took. Comment below and tell me, which one did your grandmother carry? Which one did she make in America and never explain where it came from? Because somebody's grandmother knew, and it's not too late to remember.